I am Mary, a mother who once believed she could hold her family together through the worst of storms. But looking back, I see how that storm broke everything apart and how my choices, well-intentioned though they were, destroyed something I can never fully repair. This is my story, though it feels more like a confession. My life was never extraordinary. I married young to James, my high school sweetheart. Together, we had 2 beautiful children, Sarah, our eldest, and Ethan, our baby boy. Our home was warm and simple, full of laughter, school projects, and the small messes that only kids can create. For a while, we were happy, blissfully so. Then everything changed when Sarah fell ill. She was only 10, and it began so suddenly that it felt like the ground was ripped out from under us. One moment she was playing in the backyard, her laughter ringing through the summer air, and the next, we were sitting in a sterile hospital room with doctors telling us that she was sick, seriously sick. They didn't sugarcoat it. We'd have to fight, and fight hard, just to give her a chance. The days that followed were chaos, endless tests, specialists, and appointments. James and I did everything we could to keep ourselves together, but the cracks were already forming. Our entire focus turned to Sarah. There wasn't room for anything else. Every night, I'd sit beside her hospital bed, holding her hand as machines beeped and nurses walked the halls. I'd whisper to her that everything would be okay, that we'd get through this. But in the back of my mind, I was terrified. Then came the moment when everything spiraled further. One evening, as Sarah was resting after a particularly rough treatment, James and I sat outside the hospital room, holding lukewarm coffee and trying to figure out how we'd keep going. Ethan had been staying with my parents for a few days, just until we could stabilize things, we told ourselves. My mother loved having him over, spoiling him with cookies and cartoons, and for a while that arrangement worked, but the hospital visits were becoming longer. Sarah needed us constantly. James looked at me that night, exhaustion written all over his face, and said the words that would change everything. We can't do this. Not both of them. The guilt hit me instantly. I knew what he meant. Ethan needed a stable home, a life free from the hospital walls and the tension that now weighed on every corner of our lives. But how could I choose between my children? How could I send my son away, even temporarily? I cried that night, cried harder than I had since Sarah's diagnosis. But eventually, I convinced myself it was the right thing to do. Ethan was too young to understand what was happening, too young to bear the weight of seeing his sister suffer. I pictured him running in my parents' garden, being read bedtime stories by his grandmother, far away from the sterile smell of antiseptics and the quiet terror of a hospital. I told myself he would be happier that way. The day we dropped him off was a blur. My mother and father greeted us warmly, excited to have Ethan stay with them. Ethan, always full of energy, ran straight into the house, talking about cookies and cartoons, completely oblivious to the weight of the moment. I bent down and hugged him tightly, probably too tightly, but I couldn't let go. "You're going to stay with Gran and Grandpa for a little while, okay?" I said softly, smoothing his hair. "Okay," he chirped. "Can I watch cartoons after dinner?" I nodded and smiled, trying to hold back tears. James stayed quiet, standing by the door with his keys in hand, looking ready to leave. When I finally let Ethan go, my arms felt empty. "Be good, sweetheart," I whispered before we walked out the door. James didn't linger. He gave a small wave, muttering a quick goodbye as we pulled out of the driveway. I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw Ethan standing at the window, smiling and waving. He wasn't crying. He wasn't sad. I told myself this was proof we were making the right choice. But that night, as I sat beside Sarah's hospital bed, the image of Ethan's small face stayed with me. I tried to push it down, telling myself he was safe, he was happy, and that this was temporary. But a voice inside me whispered, "What if he needs you?" As the weeks passed, temporary stretched longer than I'd imagined. Sarah's condition didn't stabilize the way we hoped. Every good day was followed by a bad one, and the cycle never seemed to end. The guilt I felt for leaving Ethan grew heavier, but I didn't know how to balance it all. I asked my mother for updates. "How is Ethan doing?" I'd ask her over the phone, my voice cracking. "He's wonderful," she'd reassure me. "Don't worry about him. Focus on Sarah." Those words gave me temporary comfort, but "don't worry" didn't erase the ache. I wanted to call Ethan, to hear his voice, but every time I picked up the phone, I froze. What would I say? How would I explain why his parents had disappeared? I told myself I'd call him soon. Tomorrow, I'd say. But tomorrow kept slipping away. Eventually, the days turned into months, and months turned into years. I stopped asking my mother for details because I couldn't bear to hear how much I'd missed. Sarah was still our focus. Her health consumed every waking thought, every decision we made. In my mind, Ethan was safe, and that was enough. At least that's what I tried to believe. But late at night, when the hospital halls were quiet and Sarah was sleeping, I'd let myself imagine the life Ethan was living without us. Did he miss us? Did he still think about his parents? Did he wonder why we didn't come back for him? Those questions ate at me, but I never allowed myself to answer them. We were doing what we thought was right. That's what I told myself over and over again. But deep down, I knew a painful truth. I was losing my son, and I didn't know how to fix it. The years after Ethan moved in with my parents blurred into one long, exhausting battle. Every day revolved around Sarah and her illness. James and I learned to live moment to moment, clinging to any small sign of improvement as though it were the light at the end of a tunnel. But the tunnel kept stretching further, and I was too scared to look back at the darkness we left behind, Ethan included. For the longest time, I avoided even thinking too much about him. I told myself I was doing what any good mother would do, sacrificing for the child who needed me the most. What I didn't realize was that I was sacrificing both of my children, one for the other. I stayed busy to keep from acknowledging the guilt. Sarah needed me constantly. Medicines, appointments, meals carefully planned to keep her strength up, and sleepless nights when she cried from pain. My days were full of routines that left me no room for much else, and James and I grew more like co-workers than partners. We had a job to do, keep Sarah alive, and everything else was pushed aside. But sometimes, late at night when Sarah was asleep, I would sit alone and let my mind wander. It was during those quiet moments that Ethan's face would appear, bright and smiling like he always had been when he was small. I would think about his laughter, the way he used to run around the living room in circles, pretending he was a superhero. I'd close my eyes and picture him growing up, getting taller, older, his voice changing, but I wasn't there to see it. There were times I almost picked up the phone to call him. I'd even dial halfway through before putting the receiver down. What would I say? How could I explain why I wasn't there? And what if he asked me when I was coming back? What answer could I give him that wouldn't be another lie? I still got updates through my mother when I asked. She would say, "Ethan's doing well, sweetheart. He's happy here with us. Don't worry." But her voice always had a small crack, like she knew I was asking out of guilt and not just curiosity. And then, years later, Sarah stabilized, not healed, but stable enough that we could take a breath for the first time in what felt like forever. The hospital visits became less frequent, and James and I finally found small pieces of normal life again. It wasn't until then that we even started to talk about Ethan. I'll never forget the day James sat me down at the kitchen table, a half-drunk cup of coffee between us, and asked, "Mary, when was the last time we saw Ethan?" The question hit me like a punch to the stomach. I couldn't answer him because I honestly didn't know. Was it a year? 2 years? Longer. Time had stretched and pulled, and we had let the days disappear without noticing. I felt like a stranger to my own son, and the realization sat in my chest like a stone. "We need to go see him," James said quietly. "It's been too long." I nodded, unable to speak. We planned a visit the following weekend. I spent the days leading up to it in a haze of nerves. I hadn't seen Ethan in years. Would he even remember us? Would he hate us? I tried not to let my thoughts spiral, but deep down, I knew this wouldn't be the warm reunion I was hoping for. When we arrived at my parents' house, it was Ethan who answered the door. I barely recognized him. He had grown so much taller, his face older and sharper, but his eyes, those were the same. They widened slightly when he saw us, and for a moment, I thought he might hug me. Instead, he just stepped back and let us in, looking unsure. "Hi, Ethan," I said softly, my voice trembling. "It's so good to see you." He didn't say anything at first, just nodded politely, like we were distant relatives stopping by for an awkward visit. My heart broke at that moment. I realized that he was a stranger to us, and we were strangers to him. We sat in the living room making small talk, but it felt forced. I asked him about school, about his hobbies, and he answered politely but briefly. He wouldn't look at me for long, like he didn't know what to say or how to feel. I couldn't blame him. I didn't know either. The visit didn't last long. After about an hour, I stood up and told him we had to go. I tried to smile and said, "We'll come back soon, okay?" Ethan didn't look convinced. "Sure," he said, like he didn't believe a word of it. On the drive home, James stared at the road silently, while I looked out the window, tears running down my face. I had always pictured Ethan waiting for us, waiting for the day we would come back and fix everything. But he hadn't been waiting. He had moved on, and we had missed it. The worst part was that I couldn't blame him. In the months that followed, I tried to write to him. I sent a couple of letters, simple ones, apologizing for not being there, saying how proud I was of him. I told him I loved him and missed him. I never got a response. My mother told me he didn't talk about the letters, but I could tell from her voice that they hadn't meant much to him. "Don't push too hard, Mary," she told me one evening. "He's built a life here. It's not fair to him." Her words stung, but she was right. We had left him behind, and now we had no right to demand our place back in his life. The years passed, and though I still thought of him constantly, I couldn't bring myself to reach out again. Sarah's condition worsened again, and I threw myself back into caring for her. It was easier to focus on what I could fix rather than what I had already broken. It wasn't until Sarah's funeral that I realized how far Ethan had slipped away from us. He arrived late, sitting in the back of the church, almost like he didn't want to be seen. When the service ended, James and I tried to talk to him, but he brushed past us without saying a word. That night, I sobbed until my chest ached. Losing Sarah was unbearable, but seeing the coldness in Ethan's eyes hurt in a different way. I had lost both of my children, and I couldn't pretend otherwise anymore. That's when I started writing to him again. I poured everything into those letters, apologies, explanations, begging for a chance to reconnect. It was probably too little, too late, but I didn't know what else to do. The silence that followed was deafening. I always thought that time would fix things, that if we gave Ethan space, he'd eventually come back to us. I believed that love, no matter how delayed or misplaced, could heal any wound. But Sarah's funeral forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding for years. My son no longer considered me his mother. At the service, when I saw him slip into the back row, my heart nearly stopped. He was tall now, a man, not the little boy I remembered clinging to my leg, begging me not to leave. I wanted to run to him, to pull him into a hug, but I froze. He sat alone, quiet and unreadable, and I could feel the wall between us like a physical thing. After the service, when the crowd thinned, I approached him with James at my side. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice cracking. He turned to look at us, and for a split second, I thought I saw the boy I used to know, the softness in his eyes, but then it disappeared, replaced by something colder. "Hi," he said, stiffly polite. He barely looked at me. James cleared his throat and said, "We just wanted to thank you for coming. It means a lot." Ethan nodded but didn't say anything. He looked at us like we were strangers on the street, people he recognized but couldn't place. My heart ached so deeply that I felt like I couldn't breathe. I wanted to tell him everything, how much I missed him, how sorry I was for every choice we'd made, but I couldn't. It was like the words had dried up in my throat. "We've been thinking about you," I finally managed to say, forcing a small smile. "We'd love to sit down and talk sometime, to catch up." Ethan's eyes narrowed just slightly, and I knew he was choosing his words carefully. "Maybe," he said flatly. It wasn't a promise. It was just a way to end the conversation. James tried to say more, but Ethan just stepped back. "I have to go," he said quickly, then turned and walked out of the church. I watched him leave, unable to stop the tears from falling. He didn't even look back. When we got home that night, the house felt impossibly empty. Sarah's room was silent, and the air seemed thick with all the words I hadn't said. James sat quietly in his chair, staring at nothing, while I paced the living room. "We lost him," I said finally, breaking the silence. "We lost both of them." James looked up, his face lined with grief. "Maybe it's not too late, Mary. He came to the funeral. That has to mean something." I shook my head. "He didn't come for us, James. He came for her." The days that followed were a blur of grief. Losing Sarah had already left me hollow, but the reality of losing Ethan too was unbearable. I spent hours in her room, surrounded by her things, remembering the years I'd spent fighting for her, fighting so hard that I let Ethan slip away. I knew I couldn't bring Sarah back, but maybe I still had a chance with Ethan. So I started writing. I poured every ounce of my guilt, regret, and love into those letters. I told him about the nights I spent sitting by Sarah's bed, wishing I could be in two places at once. I told him how much I missed him, how I thought about him every single day, even if I couldn't bring myself to call. I wrote about the memories I clung to, his laughter as a toddler, the way he'd insist on holding my hand every time we crossed the street, and the way he used to whisper, "I love you, Mama," at bedtime. I begged him to give us a chance. I told him I wasn't expecting forgiveness, just a chance to talk, a chance to fix what I had broken, but there was no response. Weeks passed, and the silence felt louder than anything I'd ever experienced. Every day I checked the mailbox, hoping to see his handwriting on an envelope. Every day I was disappointed. Finally, after months of nothing, I convinced James that we should try to see him again. "We can't just give up," I said, my voice trembling. "He's still our son. He deserves to know that we're here for him." James agreed, though I could tell he wasn't hopeful. He was tired. The years had worn him down, just as they had me. I knew from Gran that Ethan still attended midnight mass with her every Christmas. That's where we'd find him. When we walked into the church that night, I was shaking so badly I thought my knees might give out. The air was filled with the smell of candles and pine, and the choir's voices echoed softly through the pews. I spotted Ethan immediately, sitting beside Gran, his head bowed, looking so grown up and so far away from me. I sat behind him, close enough that I could almost reach out and touch him. For a moment, I closed my eyes and pretended it was like it used to be, that we were a family sitting together, that I hadn't destroyed everything. When the service ended, I followed him quietly into the aisle. My heart raced as I stepped in front of him. "Hi, sweetheart," I said softly, my voice breaking. He looked at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift in his face. Surprise, maybe, or sadness. But then his expression hardened, and his words shattered me. "Sorry. Do I know you?" It felt like a slap to the face. I blinked, stunned, my chest tightening. "Ethan, it's us. We're your parents." He shook his head. "My parents are at home," he said coldly, turning to Gran. "Are you ready to go?" I stood frozen as he walked away. James tried to speak, but I couldn't hear him over the rush of blood in my ears. We'd lost him, completely. When we got home, I sat alone at the kitchen table, clutching an old photo of Ethan when he was little. In it, he was smiling, his arms wrapped around my neck, his face pressed to mine. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the empty room. "I'm so sorry." After I handed Gran that final letter, life seemed to slow down. I'd poured my heart onto that paper, and it felt like all I had left to give. I told myself it was time to step back, that Ethan needed space and time to heal, but the silence that followed was excruciating. James and I fell into an unspoken routine. He busied himself around the house while I tried to keep my mind occupied. I started gardening again, planting flowers Sarah used to love, lilies, daisies, and lavender. It felt like a small way to honor her memory and gave me moments of peace I hadn't felt in years. Sometimes I'd kneel in the soil, hands dirty, and think of Ethan. Was he doing well? Was he happy? Did he ever think of me? I spent more time at church, too. I wasn't looking for answers anymore, just comfort in knowing that I was doing everything I could to make peace with my mistakes. The weight of guilt was always there, like a shadow I couldn't shake, but I was learning how to live with it instead of letting it consume me. James, on the other hand, seemed to be processing things in his own quiet way. He never said much, but I knew he struggled just as much as I did. Late at night, I'd sometimes hear him pacing the hallway, or I'd catch him staring at the framed picture of Sarah and Ethan on the mantle, one of the few photos we still had of them together as children. I think he held onto that picture like it was a lifeline, proof that there had once been a time when we were all together, happy and whole. One day, James finally broke the silence. "I don't think he'll ever come back," he said quietly over breakfast. It was the first time he'd acknowledged out loud what we both feared. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. Instead, I just stirred my tea, staring into the cup like it held answers I'd never find. "You don't know that," I said finally, my voice softer than I meant it to be. James shook his head. "It's been years, Mary. And after what happened at Christmas?" He trailed off, his face painted. I felt my chest tighten. Remembering Ethan's cold words that night, it hurt more than I could say, but I still wasn't ready to give up hope. "He needs time," I said firmly, though part of me wondered if I was just trying to convince myself. James sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Time doesn't always fix things." We sat there in silence after that, neither of us knowing what to say. He was right, in a way. Time didn't heal wounds on its own. It just softened the edges, but I wasn't ready to let go of the possibility, however small, that Ethan might one day forgive us. Months passed, and the silence stretched on. I busied myself with small things: church events, volunteering at the food pantry, visiting Gran. She and I grew closer during that time, mostly because she never judged me. She'd seen the way everything had unfolded from the start, and while she didn't condone the choices I'd made, she understood. "You're doing your best now," she'd say when I opened up to her. "That's all you can do." I appreciated her support, but it didn't stop me from wondering if doing my best now was enough. The truth was, no amount of letters or apologies could erase what we'd done to Ethan. I'd left him, abandoned him when he was just a boy, and I had to live with that. It didn't matter what our intentions had been. Intentions didn't erase wounds. Then one day, out of the blue, James came inside with an envelope in his hand. "It's from Ethan," he said quietly, holding it out to me. My heart stopped. For a moment, I couldn't even move. I just stared at the letter as if it might disappear if I blinked. "Are you sure?" I whispered. James nodded and placed it on the table in front of me. Gran dropped it off. "She said he finally wrote back." My hands shook as I picked it up. It was a plain white envelope, my name written on the front in Ethan's handwriting. Neat and careful, like he'd put thought into every stroke of the pen. I stared at it for a long time before I finally opened it. The letter was short. It wasn't the outpouring of emotion I'd secretly hoped for, but it wasn't cold either. Ethan thanked me for the letter I'd sent and said he appreciated the apology. He told me he wasn't ready to forgive me yet, but that he was trying to process everything. He wrote that he needed time to figure out how he felt, and that if he ever decided he wanted a relationship with us, he'd reach out. I read the letter over and over, tears streaming down my face. It wasn't what I wanted to hear, not fully, but it was more than I expected. For the first time in years, there was a sliver of hope. James sat down across from me, watching quietly as I folded the letter and set it back in the envelope. "What did he say?" he asked softly. "He's not ready," I said, my voice trembling. "But he's trying." James nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's something, isn't it?" "It's everything," I whispered, wiping my tears away. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Ethan's words. He wasn't ready to forgive us, but he wasn't shutting us out entirely either. It was more than I could have hoped for after all these years. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to fix things. Gran came over the next day, and I showed her the letter. She read it carefully and smiled softly when she finished. "I told you he has a good heart," she said. "You just need to keep giving him space." I nodded, clutching the envelope tightly in my hands. "I will." From that day forward, I stopped trying to force things. I didn't write more letters, and I didn't push for a response. Instead, I focused on what I could control, living my life in a way that honored the love I still had for Ethan and Sarah. I went back to therapy, working on forgiving myself and accepting that I couldn't undo the past. Ethan had made his boundaries clear, and I was finally ready to respect them. All I could do now was wait. Maybe one day he'd reach out. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, I would always love him. That would never change. Time has a strange way of moving when you're waiting for something that may never come. After Ethan's letter, I settled into a quiet rhythm. I didn't reach out again. I didn't push for more. I'd told myself that if I really loved him, and I do, I needed to honor his boundaries no matter how much it hurt. But I still thought of him every day. When I passed his old room, the memories came rushing back. The walls that used to hold his laughter now echoed with silence. I kept his childhood toys in a box under the bed. Dinosaurs, cars, little crafts he'd made me. Some days, I'd take them out just to hold them. Other days, the sight of them was too much, and I'd leave the room, closing the door softly behind me. James kept himself busy with work, but I knew he felt it too. He wasn't the type to talk about emotions much, but I'd catch him looking at photos of Ethan when he thought I wasn't watching. Sometimes, I'd find him sitting quietly on the back porch, staring out at nothing. It was like we were both trying to process our grief separately but didn't know how to share it. We spent more time with Gran as the years passed. She'd grown frailer, her steps slower, but her sharp wit and unwavering love never faded. She always asked about Ethan, though she never pushed me for answers I didn't have. "You're doing the right thing, Mary," she said one evening as we sat on her front porch, the summer sun dipping low on the horizon. "You gave him his space. That's love too, you know, letting someone be free to make their own choices." I nodded, though the ache in my chest reminded me how hard it was to let go. "I just hope he knows how much I love him," I whispered. Gran smiled, resting her weathered hand over mine. "He knows. Trust me, he knows." I wanted to believe her. Years went by and life moved forward. I threw myself into volunteering, finding solace in helping others. James eventually retired, and we spent our days tending to the garden, taking quiet walks, and trying to keep busy in the stillness that filled our house. Ethan was always there, though, not in body, but in my heart. I found myself imagining what his life looked like. Was he happy? Did he have friends who made him feel seen and loved? Did he still think of us? Or had we become ghosts from his past? Gran passed away on a cold winter morning when the world was quiet and still. She'd lived a full, beautiful life, and while I knew she was at peace, losing her felt like losing the last bridge to Ethan. She'd always been the one to keep us connected, even in small, unspoken ways. After the funeral, as I packed up her house, I found a small box labeled Ethan tucked in the back of her closet. Inside were letters I'd written to him over the years, the ones I'd sent through her, hoping he'd read them. There were also a few photographs. Ethan as a boy, playing in her garden, sitting at the table eating cookies. She'd held on to every piece of him, even when I couldn't. I sat there on the floor, clutching the box to my chest, and cried like I hadn't in years. It wasn't just grief for Gran, it was grief for the time I'd lost, the family I'd broken, and the little boy I'd let down. Months later, on what would have been Sarah's birthday, I found myself back at the church where we'd held her funeral. The memory of Ethan's face that day still haunted me, the way he slipped in quietly and left without a word. I wondered if he knew how much it had meant to me that he'd come, even if he didn't stay. The church was nearly empty that afternoon, save for a few flickering candles and the soft echo of footsteps. I sat in one of the back pews, staring at the stained glass window above the altar. For the first time in years, I felt calm. I whispered a quiet prayer, not for myself, but for Ethan. I prayed that he was happy, that he felt loved, and that the life he'd built gave him everything we hadn't been able to. When I left the church, I felt lighter, as though I'd finally surrendered something I'd been holding on to for far too long. One day, not long after, a letter arrived. It was addressed to me in Ethan's familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I held it, my breath catching in my throat. "Mary, what is it?" James asked, his voice full of concern. I couldn't answer him. I just sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The letter was short, just like the last one, but it said everything I needed to hear. "Mom, I'm not sure if I'm ready to forgive everything yet, but I wanted you to know I'm okay. I have a good life, and I hope you do too. I've been thinking about Sarah a lot lately, and I realized she wouldn't want us to carry so much anger forever. I don't know if we'll ever go back to being a family the way we once were, but I'm willing to try, on my terms. Take care of yourself, Ethan." Tears streamed down my face as I read it over and over, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't everything, but it was something. It was hope. James read it next, his eyes red by the time he finished. He didn't say much. He just wrapped his arms around me, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were breathing again. I didn't write back right away. I wanted to respect Ethan's boundaries and let him lead the way. Instead, I tucked his letter into a drawer, where I could pull it out when I needed to be reminded that hope wasn't gone. James and I continued living our quiet life. We planted a tree in the backyard for Sarah that spring, a symbol of growth, memory, and forgiveness. As I watched it take root, I thought about Ethan and how strong he'd become despite everything we'd put him through. He was right. Sarah wouldn't have wanted us to carry anger forever. It was time to let go, to stop trying to undo the past, and instead focus on the present. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe Ethan and I will rebuild something over time. Maybe we won't. But whatever happens, I'll keep loving him from afar, in the quiet way that mothers do. If he ever wants to come back, I'll be here, waiting, not with expectations, but with open arms. For now, I'm learning to live with both the grief and the hope. The past is full of mistakes I can't change, but I can choose to honor what's left. The memory of Sarah, the love I still carry for Ethan, and the chance, however small, to start anew. And that's enough.